Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Schreiner. I'm the MPP for Guelph and the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. And before we begin, I would like to just say, as a settler on this land, I want to express my gratitude and recognize that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Adirondack peoples. And today, Guelph is home to a number of Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people. The land we are situated on is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit and is covered under Treaty 3, the Between the Lakes Purchase. And I just want to acknowledge my deep gratitude to all Indigenous people for teaching me the importance of learning from the previous 7 generations and applying those teachings and being good stewardship of the land and water for the 7 generations that follow us. And I think that's very appropriate as we think about the conversation that we're going to have today during this webinar. And I just want to say how honored I am to be able to join the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research, a research institute that analyzes the environmental dimensions, or this discussion, I should say, is going to analyze the environmental dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic with researchers from the University of Guelph. And the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research is a newly established institute at the university, which I had the pleasure of helping to launch this past fall. And it will focus on interdisciplinary solutions to some of the world's most pressing environmental problems. And I think the COVID pandemic for many of us has been a great pause, just in some respects, to reflect not only on the public health crisis that we're facing, but also the climate and ecological crisis that we're facing. And we've experienced unprecedented changes during this pandemic. And so I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I would just going to take a minute to introduce to you the 3 excellent panelists who will be part of the conversation. So Dr. Madhur Anand is a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph and is also the director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. Her team examines natural and human-induced changes in ecosystems at a regional and global scale and their implications for sustainability. Dr. Anand has also published a book of poems, a new index for predicting catastrophes. In 2015, and later tonight, she will launch her first nonfiction book, a memoir entitled This Red Line Goes Straight Through Your Heart, with Penguin Random House Canada. In 2019, Dr. Anand was named as the director and the inaugural director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. Also on the panel is Dr. Robin Roth. And Dr. Roth is an associate professor and human environment geographer with expertise in the political, social, and cultural dimensions of conservation governance, based at the University of Guelph's Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics. She explores the implications of conservation and development policies in Southeast Asia and the enabling and constraining factors that give rise to effective, collaborative, Indigenous-led models of conservation in North America. Dr. Roth is the principal investigator for the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And finally, our third panelist is Dr. John Fryxell. Dr. Fryxell is a professor at the University of Guelph, former chair of the Integrative Biology Department, and a research ecologist for 25 years. Dr. Fryxell's research heavily focuses on understanding consumer resource dynamics and how changes in environment and organism behavior can affect that dynamic. Dr. Fryxell's lab studies this interaction on various scales, both in the field and experimental microorganisms in the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario, which he currently directs. In 2019, Dr. Fryxell was named the Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Canada's top academic honor. So as you can see, we have the perfect panel for this conversation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. So I'm going to start by directing my first question to Dr. Roth. What short-term changes have occurred to the environment during the pandemic from your perspective?
Great, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate your introduction, and thanks to GIER for organizing the session. I'm hoping we get to the discussion part because I'm really interested in generating some ideas on where the future lies for us. So when I was asked, I was thinking about this, and when I was asked to participate in the panel, it was quite a few weeks ago now. These things take a while to organize. And people were still in lockdown. And if you walked out the front door of what would otherwise be a very busy street here in Guelph, I felt like I could feel the earth just breathe, right? I felt like it was just this opening up and feeling of kind of just a moment, right, where the earth was able to kind of recover. And I felt very positive and was hanging on to some of the silver linings that we heard at that time, you know, better air quality, less CO2 emissions, brave creatures venturing out into places where, you know, humans are normally dominant. And I had birds trying to nest above my front door because apparently I was not using my front door enough to, you know, pose a threat to their habitat. So this is all like a moment where I was trying to hang on to some of these silver linings. At the time, I had also just started writing an editorial with all the other editors of biological conservation on the impacts of the pandemic on biodiversity and on our community of conservation scientists. And our message there was really on the human cost of the pandemic and the cost to knowledge production in terms of unable to continue some really important long-term studies. And, you know, since then, there's been considerably more reflection in the media as well as in scientific journals, not just on some of these good news stories, but also analysis on how society's relationship to nature is really at the core of the problem and needs to be at the core of the solution. So, I mean, you know, just a few days ago, the United Nations and World Health Organization, not exactly the most radical institutions around, came out and said, you know, basically more pandemics are on their way if we don't change that fundamental relationship. So of all the discussion that's happened in the last 6 or 7 weeks, but there's a couple of points that I find most interesting. So one is, you know, some recognition that in the environmental effects, as our MPP suggested in his opening comments, and I think it's on the poster as well, are sort of complex and contradictory, right? The temporary reductions in human presence on the landscape can be a good thing. And in some cases, you know, we have higher turtle survival rates in beaches that, you know, are not now occupied by thousands of tourists. But it can also have really divergent effects. So that reduction in human stewardship of human care of nature out on the landscape also means that some animals and ecosystems around the world are really vulnerable to wildlife and forest crime. And that's been, you know, that's been happening in a lot of different places. Fire, and this is something that concerns me a lot as we enter our fire season. And of course, the effects of industrial accidents that are now going unseen or untended. And we also have governments which are rapidly rolling back environmental protections to save some money on the kinds of costs that labor, you know, the economic cost of that labor, but also in order to stimulate the economy with construction projects and resource extraction. So the lack of humans out there on the landscape caring for nature, I see, is now increasingly more as a problem than that breath of fresh air. You know, maybe there's moments, but the second point is shorter, and that's just that there's increased recognition that our relationship to nature, you know, one that's collectively been destructive, is intimately connected to human well-being. So these 2 points, I find, you know, that some environments are vulnerable without humans looking after them, and that healthy humans equals, you know, needs a healthy nature. I find these really similar or really interesting because they're similar to the messages that I'm hearing from Indigenous thought leaders and elders of the Conservation to Reconciliation Partnership that I lead. So in that environment, we held a webinar, which I think might be available online, on Indigenous conservation in the time of the pandemic, and we wrote a blog post that captured some of those ideas. The main message there was that when humans forget to uphold our responsibilities to the natural world, when we treat nature as something to control and exploit rather than something to develop a reciprocal relationship with, it's humans who suffer. Because guess what? You know, human well-being depends on a healthy relationship with nature. So the short-term wins by the environment, for the environment, I think are only going to continue if we can use this pause in business as usual that's really been offered to us in some respects, and to really nurture that relationship and pivot quite strongly, which I'm hoping we get a chance to talk about near the middle of this webinar. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks for that. Dr. Fryxell, would you answer the same question?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today. I mean, you know, in part because the COVID-19 crisis, in a way, makes us all think a little bit more carefully about the world that we're living in, and perhaps see it through a slightly different lens. And you know, I think it's important to, you know, balance what we talk about today with the recognition that, you know, for many people, you know, the COVID-19 crisis really is one of overwhelming suffering and you know, agony, really. And I think it's important that we should start from that point of view to remember that, you know, this is a terrible experience for many, many people. But balanced against that, as Robin pointed out, there are some, you know, some sides of this that, you know, we can certainly learn from. And, you know, as we all emerge from this, which we will, hopefully stronger, wiser, and better, you know, that learning can help us to reposition ourselves in the future in a number of different ways. Now, my work is framed around how the behavior of animals helps them to survive in a very unforgiving world. And one of the real challenges for wild organisms, the kind of wild species that I study, is simply humans themselves. And we work around a concept called the human footprint. And really, that's really a multifaceted way to look at the many different ways that organisms are affected by human presence on the planet. And most of the planet we are affecting. I mean, you know, by this metric, if you take a hard look, it's pretty clear humans are affecting the vast majority of organisms all over the place. What is not so very clear is that whether it is the infrastructure that humans bring with them, or whether it's the presence of humans per se and the direct interactions that has a negative impact. And we certainly know there's a negative impact, that reduction in the movement patterns and reduction in the activity, the forms of feeding, reproductive capacity, all the metrics of quality of life for organisms are affected by humans. But what we don't know up until now is how much of that is contributed by the infrastructure that we bring along, and how much of that is actually due to our presence and our active interaction with organisms. So one of the important things about, you know, this period is that if we can tool up quickly enough, we're hoping that, you know, we can tease apart those two influences, the infrastructure versus our direct behavioral effects on wildlife, and learn something about how we can change our behavior to mediate and perhaps reduce that impact, because that's certainly something we can make rapid changes in. And I'm happy to see that there are, you know, many cooperative studies that are going across the world. One of the ones that I'm involved with is studying the movements of 51 different species all across the globe as we speak, to see how their behaviors has changed over the past 6 months. And you know, in a matter of weeks, we will have a clear picture of that. So there's any number of other research initiatives going on like that. But by the same token, you know, that learning also means that we're not out on the landscape. And as Robin said, you know, in many parts of the world, it's the presence of conservationists out in the field that actually acts as a important measure of protection. Simply because there's eyes on the ground. And without that, you know, poaching levels undoubtedly going up. We know in Serengeti, you know, just visitors that are routinely out in the park, the researchers that are in the park, the enforcement personnel that are traveling, all of those people are no longer traveling, and those eyes are no longer available to detect wrongdoing. So it's pretty clear that there's a negative side to all this too, that is probably affecting much of nature. And it's not all going to be beneficial. So gaining a kind of deeper understanding of how those pluses and minuses balance out will be really, really a key feature, I think, in seeing what the short-term effects of the pandemic might be on the environment.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to ask Dr. Anand the same question. Hopefully I don't need to repeat it. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. So yeah, I think maybe I'll come at it from a different angle. I, completely agree with what my colleagues have said so far. And so when COVID-19 hit me and my household, and I sort of had two short-term responses, one sort of at the personal level and then one at the professional level, I think like many of us. And so at the personal level, I was certainly becoming extremely aware of various privileges I have and how much more others were going to suffer than, me and my immediate family. So that, that I really do want to start from that position as well. And then, but then, even just as through personal actions of starting to going for more walks and starting to sort of seek out the green spaces around where I live, I felt that there were very, very personal changes in how I and my family were responding to the environment and valuing even more our green spaces and natural areas and the little the urban wildlife that we did have. I've been learning much more about birds than I ever have in my entire life, even though I'm an ecologist. So those are just some very personal ones. And then hearing stuff on the news, right? The things that the positive stories that were being presented to us. I was very personally struck by, for example, a story coming out of rural India, where in this village, people looking out their windows could see the Himalayas for the first time in their generation, in their lives, because of reduced air pollution, because of COVID-19, because of the shutdowns. And there were so many stories like that of clear waters, clear air, wildlife, positive stories of wildlife entering into places that we were leaving as humans. So that's just a short-term personal response that, I found, quite profound. But then, because I'm also an environmental researcher and an ecologist and studying human environment dimensions, it did also make me very quickly try to understand, the problem from a research perspective, right? And papers were starting to come out about, sort of detecting the numeric changes. This 17% global decline is sort of the most recent paper I saw in Nature Climate Change of carbon emissions, during the pandemic, reductions of air pollution in various different parts of the world. And so then as a researcher, I started to think of those. And of course, as a scientist, those are not surprising, right? We've known the relationship between humans and air quality and humans and climate change for decades, if not, a century. So the fact that if you stop emissions, you'll get, better values, right, is nothing. That cause and effect is very well understood, right? But it's the intensity of it, the dramatic changes that are really unprecedented. And so from that perspective, it does offer a lot of opportunities to try to understand the long-term impacts of these short-term changes, because we just haven't seen them before in scientific data. So that was one thing. 30 seconds, let's see. I will, I might just stop there and save a little time at the end.
Great, you've actually set me up for the next question I want to ask all of you. But before I do that, I just want all of the participants to know that you can use the question function to tab to send questions to us as we move forward, and I'll try to ask as many of the questions that come forward as possible. So Dr. Anand, I'm going to go to you to the next question, and you kind of started heading in this direction. So what do you think the long-term impacts of the pandemic might be on our relationship with the environment?
Yeah, perfect, great. So I can just continue where I'd left off. So along with the shutdowns, right? The economic shutdowns that have led to reductions in pollution and so on. And I should mention, like my colleagues did, it's not all good news environmental stories, even in the short term. There are negative impacts. There has been increased plastic pollution, for example, from changes in our consumer behavior during the pandemic. Like we're buying things in different ways, or they're being sold in different ways, which is increasing plastic production. There's increase in medical waste as well. So there are some negative short-term things as well. But in terms of the long term, what I am interested to look at, and I think what really needs to happen and is happening, is changes in behavior, in human behavior at many different scales, individual, social, changes in our social norms, which, like have just happened so quickly. But I think the fact that we're able to sort of adopt new social norms so quickly, I think it's going to, really play a bigger part in the multidimensional problem that environment is, including, of course, climate change. Part of that big process is the process of social learning. We've seen that be incredibly important and effective, I think, in some places more than others. But this social learning idea, this idea that we can transmit information on how to behave, how to change our behavior in order to help flatten the curve, right? A new term that has just permeated quickly. That's a form of social learning. Everybody knows what flattening the curve is now. We need the equivalent of that for climate change. And I think that maybe with this experience, I'm hoping that will also, it will trigger that type of long-term change.
I'm so happy you said that, because I actually wrote an op-ed, maybe a month or two ago, that was entitled "Let's Flatten the Climate Curve."
I saw that. I saw that, and that was brilliant.
Yeah, so thank you. So Dr. Fryxell, I wanted to ask you the same question. What do you think of the long-term impacts?
Well, it's really tricky, these kind of questions, because we would love to think that humans are, ready to embrace change and to learn readily. I hate to say it, but I honestly think that we will revert to our normal behavior very quickly, unless we make it a really unified decision to make it to reassess. And I agree with Madhur when she says, this is a demonstration case for new ways of doing things. And as Madhur said, as well, some of those habits, could recur for a long time, but they're more likely to recur if we actually make a conscious effort to remind ourselves that, it's time for us to evolve. We arrived in this crisis in part because of the presence, the really overwhelming presence we have on the planet, and the way that we're exposing ourselves to new invasive diseases. We really need to kind of take this as a lesson about how to revise ourselves and to be conscious of that. This seminar is an example. Academics and all kinds of people in modern society fly across the world to have 15-minute conversations with each other. And, that's, I think, the kind of behavior that is an example of how, things that we could drop. We could have this sort of webinar and communicate with our peers just as well as holding scientific conferences, for example. I mean, there's a time that those are necessary, but maybe not all the time. And, by the same token, maybe it's not necessary for us to travel as extensively as we do, and to think about the business connections. Do we really have to, fly on sales missions around the world and burn up fossil fuels at the rate we are? So, these are perhaps the kind of things that we could learn a little bit from. And, I think that would be great if it were to happen. But I fear that if we don't make a conscious effort to keep that at the top of the agenda, that we will revert very quickly to our normal patterns of behavior. That seems to be the case as soon as lockdowns are relaxed. I mean, all around us, we see instantly, changes in behavior that, are not very helpful, frankly, in flattening that curve. So, perhaps repeated exposure to the cost of not learning, will be a good thing, to echo Madhur's thoughts about collective behavior. In the longer term, I mean, some of the beneficial things we've talked about in nature, are really behavioral things. And I'll be surprised if some of those things have long-term consequences that are profound, simply because, populations require a little bit more investment than that, than a few weeks of improved conditions in order to, fundamentally improve. But it is pretty clear that, that there could be some very favorable things that could happen as a consequence of humans not being out on the landscape in some places. And if that's the case, that would be wonderful. But I guess the the bottom line depends on how long we're in this. I mean, much of this reflection is based on a relatively short period, 3 months or so of serious lockdown, and we'll see where we're at. I mean, if the current thinking is correct that this could be a couple of years of challenge, then I think that also is going to have a lot to do with how profound the impact is in the longer term.
Great, thanks for that. And Dr. Roth, do you want to give your thoughts on the longer term?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I like the fact that we have some half, glass half full and half glass empty kind of, I think it does. And so for me, I'm a bit of a, I like to be positive. And so I am taking actually a lot of hope in the speed at which some things have changed. Yeah, I also agree with John that I'm also a bit disheartened with the speed at which things have changed back really quickly in some respects. But I think it's up to those of us who are privileged enough to have a microphone and to have access to education and to media and so on to kind of keep the pressure on a little bit. And I have heard increasing calls, like from institutions that I wouldn't have guessed even a few months ago, saying things publicly. And so I think that it is sort of up to us to grab the moment, right? And to recognize that with the horror that a lot of people are experiencing with this disruption and are going to be occupied with that, and we can't expect anything else from them. Those of us who aren't experiencing that can certainly say, hey, listen, like proof positive, right? Things appeared like how many decades have we been talking about climate change? And how many days, right? And yet nothing. Like it seems impossible. Bike lanes seemed impossible in Toronto like 6 months ago. And so all of a sudden things are actually, so you can start to go, okay, maybe it's just it's a decision. We have to decide both individually and collectively that we want a different kind of world that got us here in the first place. And so, this isn't for me a case of rebuilding an economy by incentivizing consumer decisions to get better windows and better cars. This is a much more fundamental reshift. So our economies function how they're supposed to function, which is to prioritize well-being, not profit, right? For me, like I'm not an economist, I don't know what that looks like, but I know it doesn't look like what we have. And I know that if we just rebound into something that looks very similar to what we were 6 months ago, we're going to have this conversation over and over and over again. And I mean, maybe it's going to be a rocky ride, as John kind of suggested. Maybe this is good. Maybe this can be a bad year, right? Where a lot of things keep on resurfacing and kind of reminding us that we have decisions we can make here and we can make them differently. The folks that I work with on the Conservation to Reconciliation Partnership talk a lot about different models of conservation, which right now that's our audience, our conservation folks. But those models of conservation are also models of economic well-being, right? They're models that put forward a relationship between humans and nature that actually generates well-being versus and abundance, instead of sort of an idea that we have to sort of save the last vestiges of nature from an encroaching humanity, which I think at times it absolutely looks like that, and at times we have to do that. But for the long-term vision, that's not going to get us where we need to go, as far as I'm concerned. So I think for me, it's like, I don't know what's going to happen, what the long-term effects are, but I do know that we're in a really interesting moment where I wouldn't have imagined 6 months ago, and it gives me hope because we can actually decide now collectively to do something differently. And so that's, I'm hoping that forums like this can start to inspire some of the small decisions, like Madhur suggested there's been some bad decisions lately, like a lot of disposable products and so on and so forth. Instead of kind of giving into that, what can we do on the micro scale to make those decisions differently? And then how do we push our elected officials and companies and everyone else to do things really radically differently? So that's where I'm at right now.
It's interesting you say that, because I was in a part of a meeting this morning and somebody asked, what's your biggest takeaway? And I said, it's amazing how fast we've been able to mobilize around something to change our behavior, and which actually sets up the first audience question very well. And I'm going to direct this to you, Dr. Anand. Will potential, in quotes, death need to be the carrot in front of us to affect social change? This seems what is at the core of any social change currently.
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen that with COVID-19, right? I mean, so much of the social change has been around a public health crisis, catastrophes, really. So I suppose the simple answer to that question is yes. But I think, and kind of, I think, echoes some of the comments also that we heard from Robin. I think our concept of health. So, I mean, there's the acute crisis of death, right? But then there's a larger question around health and around well-being. And, the things that affect death are very complex, right? So if you look at even just how United Nations defines environment and sustainability more broadly, there are 13 sustainable development goals, and it talks about health and social equity and various types of environmental preservation of environmental areas. All of these things are linked. I think what we've seen with COVID-19 is how an invisible threat, right, was rendered very visible through a lot of scientific research, a lot of modeling, epidemiological modeling. And to me, this is, despite my, also disappointment with some of the recent things I've seen, I think generally speaking, we saw a huge success in governmental collaboration with scientists across the world around rendering an invisible threat to humanity visible through graphs, right? Through models, through predictions. We've been doing that for climate change, but perhaps there's some missing piece there in terms of affecting social change. And so I think that's something that we maybe need to look at a little bit more. But I do still think that all of the processes that we have seen happen, all of the collaboration, all of the coordination, we've seen governments work at different levels, regionalization of response, all of that type of cooperation towards mitigation of this disease can also all apply to climate change. And I'm hopeful in that regard.
Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. If we can listen to the scientists for COVID, why not for climate? So Dr. Fryxell, the next question is going to ask you to do a little history lesson for us. So was there any positive effects on ecology of the environment from the influenza pandemic in 1919?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I honestly think that it's fascinating when some of these historical accounts are dredged up again of past epidemics, tracing all the way back to Athens. It's a sobering reminder of how precarious human civilization is and how it doesn't take much to tip us into, an undesirable new equilibrium that's, difficult to cope with. I mean, I'm saying that as a scientist, but as, you know, a person living on the planet, that of course is not how we want to live. We want to kind of maintain a kind of positive outlook and move forward. But, you know, these past epidemics have overturned, you know, societies. And to some degree, the social changes that you know, accompanied the influenza, you know, epidemic in the early part of the 1900s was a good example. You know, there were, you know, severe kind of social dislocations that occurred as a consequence. And I'm sure that, you know, there were some, you know, environmental consequences that went along with that. Trouble is that ecology is, you know, a very young science. And so there's very little from that time that we can go back and reliably use as evidence. But, you know, if we draw parallels between the kind of changes that we now know, you know, are mechanistically likely to ensue, I think it's a reasonable projection to think that, you know, some of those impacts were profound simply because the changes in the number of people and, you know, some of the spatial distribution, and certainly human demography was changed pretty considerably by that event. And in the end, most of the human impact on this planet traces back to demography and how fast we reproduce. So, you know, anytime you have a change of, you know, even a few percent in the human population growth, there are profound impacts for the future decades. Frankly, I think that would be one of the really great parts of this discussion to hear more about, you know, to think about how precarious our position is in terms of our demography and how important our demography is against the rest of nature.
Great, thanks for that. Dr. Roth, the next question I'll direct to you. We are not seeing the same level of behavioral change in the US related to COVID. The politics of masks being just one of many examples. What is the level of concern about tackling behavioral changes linked to climate change without support or buy-in from the US?
Thank you. Yeah, well, we're wading into difficult territory here, but I'm a citizen of the United States as well as Canada, so I feel like I should be able to answer this question. You know, the reality is that we're not. Yeah, so we have to just differentiate between governments in the United States and people and different levels of government. So most of the climate change action that has happened in the absence of any federal leadership on the matter has happened in municipal governments and in regional governments in the United States. So states and municipalities are actually taking action far and above beyond what the national government is taking in the states. And so I still have some hope that they can get on, you know, with the program down there. You know, but obviously it's a huge consumer society. And so just to stir the pot a little bit more, while numbers matter, and there's a lot of them, it also really matters what they do. And it matters what we all do. And so, you know, I think either we make different decisions collectively and move forward to something different, or we'll be forced there, right? Because we will see more violence and we will see more death and we will see all of those things that sort of force, you know, a real societal shift. And so, you know, this pandemic does remind us of that vulnerability, I think, and those of us who can afford to sit with that for a bit and be uncomfortable with it and hopefully start to act differently should, you know, this is our responsibility right now, I'd suggest. So, you know, what level of concern do I have about behavioral change in the States? It's a really different kind of culture down there, in my sense, and civil liberties are really important to folks. And so a lot of that, and I think, dare I say that the ways in which information flows and the ways in which people are getting their information now is also stoking the fire a little bit when it comes to how to react to this particular disease. But on the other side, I mean, here, like, we know statistically that as long as numbers stay relatively low, quite a few of us are fine. And so we're actually taking collective action. This is another thing I think is really good. We're taking collective action to protect the most vulnerable in society. And I think that's for me, that's something that we really value. And in societies that maybe that isn't the, you know, the message that's coming from their governments, then they're not thinking in those terms. You know, yeah, globally, right, it's been less than 20% of CO2 emissions are down so far, right? Less than 20%. We had pretty much a halt in the global economy, and we only made up 20%. So clearly, much larger structural changes are needed. And we can, even if we just sat around like this for the next 5 years, we'd still be in trouble. So, you know, there's more structural things that are needed. And so I guess my point is just that we keep doing what we're doing, and we keep on trying to convince folks that that climate change matters. And there's a lot of good people in the States that are doing the same thing, and some levels of government, I think, are making real progress down there. So eventually, change tends to not happen really linearly, and there's a threshold, and then things shift really quickly. And so I'm thinking we're at that place where that shift can happen over the next 6 months, again, if we make the right decisions.
Yeah, your 20% number is a bit frightening when you think of how little economic activities happening and the kind of structural changes needed. So Dr. Anand, I wanted to ask another audience question. How do we hold on to these positive aspects on the environment as a result of the pandemic and developing our new normal post-pandemic? Madhur, I think you're still on mute.
I just said if and when that comes. Okay, positive. I mean, I'm going to preface an answer to that because I do feel there are hopeful things to hold on to, but I do want to preface it to acknowledge once again that when this crisis for humanity is really putting a lens on several crises that humanity faces. So yes, this is a public health crisis, but what we have seen and what we know, and what we've known for a long time. I mean, look at any major report coming out of the UN, the IPCC, even the World Health Organization. We know that these are linked to social equity and to environment more generally, these public health crises. So there are a lot of negative things that we're experiencing right now, and it's pretty hard to stay focused on the positive. And I want to acknowledge that, for example, even this current Black Lives Matter movement and protests around the world, they have been called, it's another pandemic, right? So our humanity is suffering several pandemics simultaneously, and COVID-19 has brought one to the forefront, but it has revealed these other invisible viruses like systemic racism and extreme consumerism, et cetera, that are perpetuating our climate change problem. So sorry, the question that wanted me to talk about positive, but I do want to acknowledge all of those dimensions because we need to. How can you stay positive? Well, everybody will have to find their own way, but personally, I think all of these examples that we're seeing, to me, if you can think about them not only in their mechanistic, the relationship. So, for example, this reduction in air pollution, allowing us to see the Himalayas. To me, that type of relationship allows me to actually revalue the environment, revalue like the Himalayas as a beautiful aesthetic landscape. Aesthetic value is a huge aspect of how humans value the environment. And it's just one of the many types of, they're called ecosystem services that we derive from the environment. And yes, clean air, clean water is important, but these other dimensions that I think are being very, very visually and very vividly shown to us, I think might even increase how we value ecosystems. And so if we could hold on to that and our changed perception, and maybe include that value, that aesthetic value, to the increased focus on the birds in your backyard, or the increased appreciation of natural areas, you know, we may have been taking them for granted.
Great, thanks for that. And this next question warms my heart because people are starting to use the language I like. Is so this is for Dr. Roth. Is how can corporations start flattening the climate curve in an urgent and meaningful way?
I feel like we should be asking you this question, Mike. Why do I have to answer it?
Trust me, I wanted to answer a few, but
okay.
that's not my day to
I'll
do
make
it.
my answer really short, so you can chip in. And there's some good questions to come here, so I don't want to beat it too hard. But I mean, first of all, corporations come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and they have lots of different things going on. So to answer it specifically is going to be tricky. But I mean, I would suggest that there's a lot of technology that exists that people are not investing in or using because it costs more than the good old-fashioned technology. Well, I'm sorry, we're just going to have to again toss that out, right? The amount of government subsidy and support for the oil and gas industry in the early stages of its development far strips anything that we've thrown, the peanuts that we've thrown at the clean energy sector over the last few decades. And so we really need to collectively decide that it's okay to develop these new technologies. We have to accept a future with a low carbon economy, and we have to incentivize corporations to make decisions differently. And some of that has to do with supply chains. Some of it has to do with their own support of the well-being of their own employees. You know, some of it has to do with changing the kinds of things that they're producing, right? And the way they're producing it. So I think there's a lot of ideas out there that they can take up if, again, they take. And I think, you know, I was thinking about this a little earlier in the discussion, but there's only so far we can go, and maybe this is why we're at the moment, but there's only so far we can go by reading scientific data and reading all the good, like, sustainable development goals and intellectualizing things. In the end of the day, we actually have to feel something. Like, you have to feel compelled to make some change. And this is where the pandemic has delivered that feeling to a lot of people. And so we have to take, again, I'm like a broken record, but we've got to take advantage of that because I don't think change happens any other way. It doesn't change through like really tight logical arguments. If it did, we wouldn't be here, right? Like, the science has been aligned with a different economy for a long time. So yeah, again, take advantage of that. And I think corporations can flatten the climate curve. Window over to Mike. If they take it seriously and look, get some advisors and help them figure it out, they can lower their carbon footprint, and not just by planting trees elsewhere. They have to change structurally how they produce and how they operate.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's good that we have one of our panelists writes poetry and fiction as well as being a scientist to talk about that it's not all charts and graphs. So Dr. Fryxell, the next one is for you, and it sort of builds actually a bit on the last question, but takes it to the personal level. With COVID, more people want to drive cars over using transit to avoid exposure to risk. So how do we get urban dwellers to buy and drive EVs over gas cars, since cars are such a major source of GHG emissions?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because, you know, at the same time, to try and, you know, kind of respond to one threat, we, you know, exacerbate another. And, you know, it's kind of like the increased use of plastics that Madhur, you know, commented on, and any number of other things. In a way, these are kind of retreats into bad behavior that, you know, I kind of, to some degree, indicate, you know, how we put ourselves first. And, you know, I think it's kind of, once again, a learning point where, you know, as we kind of balance our need to kind of do the proper thing to take care of ourselves and our loved ones, it's also a pretty good idea to remind ourselves that these have to be short-term things that we do not want to continue. You know, we really need to kind of get away from use of plastics. We were well on our way in that direction. As we emerge from this, I hope, you know, we all remember that there were higher priorities that need to be brought into play. And frankly, you know, it's interesting. I mean, using cars because for safety reasons is probably counterbalanced to some degree by, you know, changes in the amount that people are driving, the distances they're driving, and their ability to kind of cross the country and whatnot. Personally, you know, if that overall kind of distance can be depressed, if we can all kind of reflect on ways that we can economize and reduce the number of times we make, you know, useless trips, you know, I think it would make a huge difference. And you know, even better if we, you know, can find a way to, you know, find alternative modes of transportation in the future. But I do think those are huge challenges. And, you know, and they're going to recur in the future for a couple of years as people try to grapple with avoiding mass transit. These are all things that we don't want to lose. And we need to keep that public discussion going so that we don't forget that these have to be short-term fixes for problems that are much bigger and have major consequences.
Yeah, I agree. It's something I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to public transit. This next question is for Dr. Anand. I'm going to shorten it a little bit, and you had mentioned earlier about the plastic waste issue. And so how can we overcome or resolve and address the rise in plastic waste now during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic future?
Yeah, thanks. I'll preface that by saying that I learned about that because at GIER we did a literature review of all the scientific papers that have been published on COVID-19 and the environment, which is available to the public and to everybody listening to this. We'll post that on our website at GIER, and so you. If you go to the website, you'll just see the link for all of those papers, and there's little short 2 or 3 sentence summaries of all the papers. So I encourage you to really read a lot of the research yourself. Many of these papers are quite accessible to the public. I think that the COVID-19, the scale of it, caught governments and the health sector off guard with respect to, certainly just, increased medical attention required, but also the special kinds of equipment that was needed, right? All the PPE, which, there were shortages of, we're still trying to, manufacture it. And so I think just not being prepared for it just required the quickest and easiest and safest, response for humanity, which I think is the ethical thing to do, right? You just have to do what it takes to save the lives. So there's not much we can do about that now. But in terms of lessons learned, I have no idea if this is possible, but I hope somebody's researching how to make, eco-friendly PPEs and all of the other stuff, right, that is required. And so again, that's something that I think possibly we could learn. And we already, as you did say, Mike, we I think we were approaching at certainly, I would say globally, at a level where we saw some really dramatic changes in personal behavior, human, but also in corporate behavior with respect to the use of plastics, right? Like things being banned, bottles being banned, plastic drinking straws being banned, right? So we saw that coming about, and I think now that just has to extend to pretty much, things required to get us through the next pandemic.
Thanks for that. So we're getting close to the end. So there's about 2 audience questions that I unfortunately don't think I'm going to get to because I want us to wrap up in time, and I want to give each one of you an opportunity to give your final thoughts. But I will say that the 2 questions, one was, we're sort of hardwired to think about the immediate and not the long term, and climate requires that. And then the other one is just concerns that economic recovery is going to, government's going to say, hey, we have economic recovery at all costs. So I'm going to give each one of you an opportunity as your final wrap up thoughts. If you have an opportunity to incorporate some thoughts around those 2 questions, feel free. And so I think we'll start with Dr. Roth. Why don't we give your final thoughts, and we'll go across like we did in the opening.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think to think about those 2 things, am I concerned? Yeah, I'm actually really concerned that people are just going to default to the economic recovery at all costs. there's some good work being done, putting out all sorts of plans, kind of the green plans of the kinds of things we can spend money on and can stimulate the economy, but then still sort of start to shift us in that direction. And I'm hoping people are listening. I know that there's good people out there who are being loud about that, and op-eds being written every day that suggest that. So again, I have to go back to our own personal responsibility in this. If we have to be loud if this is what we want, right? Because it is easier. It is the path of least resistance to just go back to where we were and then be back here again in 5 years. And if we don't want our elected officials to do that, if we don't want to purchase things from companies that do that, then we're going to have to be loud about it. And so, it's the situation that we're in right now. So, both I think of it as like my 3-year-old who's like both wonderful and then horrible, right? Like the two things are happening at the same time, and that's kind of where we're at now too. And it's a wonderful time, and it's also a horrific time. And it's just if we want something to come out of this that is going to be positive, then it's kind of up to us to make it happen. And by us, I really mean a collective us, and those of us who have the ability to make it happen. But I do worry about it because I think even at a very micro scale in the workforce and elsewhere, I don't see a lot of changes happening. It's sort of like everyone's still in the hunker down, let's just get through this and then we can just pop up and be back to normal. And I think it's time to start making some small changes. Expect less, right? I'm going to expect to travel less, and we all should expect those kinds of things. We're not going to expect mass amounts of wealth accumulation in the next 5 years, and we shouldn't. So we should accept an economic recovery that's a bit slower but a bit greener, and call for it and hold people to account. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dr. Fryxell. Your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you were calling on me or not, Mike. I guess it's pretty clear that one of the really important lessons from the pandemic has been just how connected and interdependent we are, both in an economic sense, because disruption of food chains and disruption of the normal kind of medical practices. These things have huge ramifications. But by the same token, it's pretty obvious that we have those kind of connections with nature too in the larger environment. And so maybe it's kind of a lesson about our larger place in the world, and perhaps that's one way you can kind of resolve what would otherwise be a tension between economy and nature, in recognizing that we're all in it together. And that phrase has been kind of recurring over and over again, but the we in this case extends to a much broader range of organisms than people often intend. But I still think that phrase has great meaning, that we are all in this together. And as we start to kind of learn from the pandemic and learn to function by merging science with policy in new ways, which we are starting to do, and to have a broader dialogue about the long-term ramifications of changes in policy, these are all positive things that can help us to balance ways that we can live within nature at the same time as having a functioning economy. So, I mean, if we do learn from this process and these hard lessons, it really could guide us to new ways of doing things so that we truly can function better together as an entity.
Thanks for that. And I think it's appropriate that as the director of the Institute, Dr. Anand, that you would have the final word today. Oh, I think you may still be muted.
Sorry about that. I just assume when I go live, you guys take over the power there. Yeah, I'll just reiterate. I agree with what my colleagues have said. It's actually really nice to have this conversation with them. We tend to really stay in our silos, and one of the things that I think GIER really hopes to do is to bring us out of our silos, to talk about science, but just to talk about life. And here we are in a pandemic where we kind of have to talk about both. So one thing I do want to really, reiterate that, it's really amazing how many social norms have changed. That doesn't happen very quickly and very often, but Robin's right. There is a threshold response to changes in social norms, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it with the pandemic. We're seeing it with economy. We're seeing it with social justice. But most of all, I think what I want to say is that what we've seen, what is unique about COVID-19 is that what we've seen is that really nobody is immune, right? And that's where we're all in it together really is a necessity, because you can't just go and hide. You can go and try and hide in your villa in the mountains, but ultimately, like, no one is immune to this. And that's why we've seen such a widespread, rapid, and unprecedented change in society. But that's exactly verbatim, all those adjectives are exactly the kind of change that IPCC has called for climate change. So if we can somehow try to better understand the fact that we're not immune, nobody's immune to climate change effects and to systemic racism and to all of the other, plagues that we're dealing with, we can have a positive pathway forward.
Thank you. I just want to thank the University of Guelph and GIER for hosting this webinar, and it's been an honor to join such three accomplished panelists. And I just want to wish everyone well. Be safe, and don't forget to wash your hands and wear a mask. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.